The ferryman, a man whose face was a roadmap of sea-weathered lines, merely grunted when Dean stepped onto the slick, barnacle-crusted dock. The air, thick and tasting of salt and decay, clung to him like a shroud. Dean pulled his worn woolen coat tighter, the fabric rasping against his stubbled jaw. He hadn't shaved in days, perhaps weeks. The exact duration blurred, like so much else since the silence had descended. He clutched the strap of his duffel bag, its weight a familiar anchor against the tempest inside him. Solitude. That was what he sought on this forgotten rock, this island named for a myth of perpetual twilight. The ferry, a rusted hulk groaning against its moorings, was already turning, its single cyclopean headlight piercing the encroaching fog like a jaundiced eye. Dean watched it shrink, a growing speck swallowed by the gray maw of the ocean and the sky. He was truly alone now. A profound, aching emptiness settled in his chest, a familiar companion since the day the world had tilted on its axis. He hoped this place, this desolate inheritance, would offer a different kind of emptiness, one that might finally allow him to breathe. The path to the lighthouse keeper's cottage was little more than a goat track, winding through gnarled, wind-stunted trees that clawed at the sky. The soil was boggy in places, the air heavy with the scent of brine and damp earth. Dean's boots sank with soft, sucking sounds. Overhead, gulls cried, their plaintive calls echoing the desolation. He imagined his grandfather, a man he barely remembered, making this same journey day after day, year after year. What had driven him to such isolation? Dean wondered if he was about to find out. After nearly an hour of trudging, the path opened onto a low bluff. There, hunched against the relentless wind, stood the cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a squat stone structure with a slate roof that sagged in the middle like a weary brow. The windows, dark and vacant, stared out at the churning gray expanse of the sea. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the stone walls, its tendrils prying apart mortar, reclaiming the human intrusion. The cottage felt less like an inheritance and more like a tomb. He pushed open the gate, its rusted hinges shrieking a protest that sliced through the quiet. The garden was a tangle of weeds and thorny bushes, obscuring what might once have been a neat patch. He picked his way through the overgrown wilderness, his eyes scanning the neglected details. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the grime-coated windows. Dean stepped into a small, dark hallway. To his right, a kitchen, equally desolate. He ran a hand over a dusty wooden banister leading to a narrow staircase. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of grit, a testament to years of abandonment. He pushed open a window in the living room, letting in a gust of raw, salty air. The sound of the waves, a low, ceaseless rumble, immediately filled the space. A constant, hypnotic presence. It wasn't the rhythmic crash he expected, but a deeper, more resonant thrum, as if the very bedrock of the island vibrated. As he moved through the small rooms, a faint, almost imperceptible scrape caught his attention. He froze, listening. The sound didn't repeat. He told himself it was the house settling, the old wood groaning under the weight of time. But a knot tightened in his stomach. He was alone here. Utterly. Stepping back outside, he walked around the perimeter of the cottage, careful of the crumbling flagstones and the encroaching weeds. The wind whipped at his hair, tugging at his coat. He noted the sturdy rock formations, the sheer drop to the churning sea below. It was a beautiful, savage place. Then he saw it. Partially hidden beneath a dense thicket of thorny gorse, almost indistinguishable from the gray rock face, was a low, concrete structure. It was perhaps 10 feet square, mostly buried, with a thick, rusted steel hatch set flush with the ground. No windows, no visible ventilation. Just a heavy, unyielding slab of metal, secured by a massive, corroded padlock that looked older than Dean himself. His grandfather had never mentioned anything like this in the sparse letters Dean had received over the years. This wasn't a cellar, not for a cottage this small. This was something else entirely. An underground bunker. The words formed in his mind, heavy and unsettling. Why would a lighthouse keeper need a bunker? The question hung in the frigid air, unanswered. Dean knelt, brushing away a layer of damp moss from the hatch. He leaned closer, a faint metallic scent now mingling with the brine. Nothing. Only the omnipresent rumble of the sea, now seeming to pulse with a low, rhythmic throb beneath his feet. Or was it just his imagination, amplified by the isolation and the growing unease? He stood, dusting off his trousers. The discovery was perplexing, an unexpected complication in his quest for uncomplicated solitude. He had come here to escape the ghosts of his past, but this island, this cottage, seemed to hold its own. And whatever lay beneath that hatch, it felt ancient, dormant, and profoundly unwelcoming. Dean swallowed, the dryness in his throat a stark contrast to the damp air. He had a profound sense that his arrival had not gone unnoticed. The cottage perched on the cliff's edge was less a sanctuary and more a tombstone, weathered by centuries of salt spray and relentless wind. Its windows, milky with sea grime, stared out like vacant eyes. Dean wrestled the rusted key in the lock, the mechanism groaning in protest before yielding with a final metallic shriek. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something cloying and ancient like forgotten seaweed left to rot. He dropped his duffel bag onto the grimy floorboards, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. He spent the first few hours in a determined, almost frantic effort to impose order. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom. He wiped down surfaces, threw open a creaky window to let the cold, briny air scour the stale interior. From the window, he could see the ocean, a vast, churning expanse of slate gray. He watched the tide for a long moment, a habit from his cartography days, noting the ebb and flow. But something felt off. Then, with an unnatural speed, it surged back, crashing against the base of the cliff with a force that vibrated through the very foundations of the cottage. Dean frowned, pressing his palm against the cold glass. Just a strong current, he told himself, the island's peculiar geography playing tricks on his perception. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised purples and oranges, the wind picked up. Dean paused, a half-unpacked box of books clutched in his hands. He strained his ears, listening past the howl of the gale. There it was again, a low, guttural murmur, almost a chant, weaving through the wind's lament. He shook his head, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. Solitude was already getting to him. The mind played tricks in isolation, conjuring voices from the white noise of nature. It was just the wind, nothing more. He decided to explore the cottage's small, cramped rooms, hoping to find some sense of his grandfather's life here, some echo of the man he barely knew. In the small study, dominated by a large, scarred wooden desk, Dean ran his fingers over the grimy surface. Tucked away in a shallow drawer, beneath a pile of brittle, yellowed charts, he found it. A leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stained as if it had been submerged in water. He lifted it, the aged leather crumbling slightly under his touch. The pages within were a chaotic jumble of neat script and frantic, disturbing sketches. Dean's eyes widened. His grandfather, a man of precise lines and meticulous records, had filled these pages with impossible geometries and monstrous, vaguely aquatic forms. The ink, in places, had bled, creating a blurred, watery effect that made the illustrations seem to writhe. He turned a page, his breath catching in his throat. Amidst a scrawl of indecipherable notes, a phrase stood out, underlined repeatedly in a hand that grew increasingly desperate. The deep song. Further down, a warning, barely legible. It calls, it waits. His grandfather had been a practical man, grounded in the tangible world of currents and constellations. This was the work of a mind, unraveling. He tried to rationalize it, picturing his grandfather, alone on this remote outpost, succumbing to the crushing weight of isolation, his imagination running wild with the endless, indifferent ocean as his only companion. Perhaps he'd been ill, or simply gone mad from loneliness. It was a coping mechanism, Dean thought, an attempt to explain the unexplainable through fantastical narrative. He closed the journal, the warped leather cool against his palm. The tide, he noticed, was once again behaving erratically, pulling back, then rushing in, creating an unsettling rhythmic gasp against the rocks. A shiver traced its way down his spine. The cottage felt smaller, more confining. He needed to clear his head, to find something solid, something real. He remembered a faint line on one of his grandfather's old property maps, a dotted path leading away from the cottage, marked simply as storage. He grabbed a flickering lantern and stepped out into the biting wind, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. The path, overgrown and barely discernible, led him away from the cliff's edge, winding through a tangle of gnarled, wind-sculpted trees. In the center, almost swallowed by the encroaching undergrowth, was a low, squat concrete structure. A heavy, rusted metal door set flush into the ground stood before him. This had to be it. He knelt, scraping away the dirt and dead leaves that obscured the corroded latch. The metal groaned as he pulled it open, revealing a gaping black maw, an underground bunker. What had his grandfather stored down there? Hungry? The chill that had settled in Dean's bones refused to dissipate. His grandfather, a man whose hands had known the rough grain of timber and the slick tangle of fishing nets, had filled a ledger with rambling, disjointed observations that now seemed less the product of a failing mind and more a coded message. The initial shock had given way to a gnawing curiosity, a determination to understand what could have driven such a pragmatic man to record these strange, fragmented thoughts. Solitude, Dean had sought. What he had found instead was a puzzle, sharp-edged and unsettling. He began his investigation in the island's tiny community archives, a single room attached to the old general store, smelling of dust and forgotten paper. The volunteer, a stooped woman with spectacles perched on her nose, seemed surprised by his interest in anything beyond tide charts. Dean sifted through brittle newspapers and yellowed parish records. He found no direct mention of his grandfather's peculiar notes, but he unearthed something far more disquieting: a collection of local folklore. The island, it turned out, had a rich, dark tapestry of legend woven into its very fabric. Most disturbing were the accounts of the Covenant, an unspoken agreement, a balance maintained by the islanders for generations, though the specifics were always left tantalizingly, terrifyingly blank. Dean read of offerings made to the sea, not for bounty, but for peace. He noted the recurring symbol, a jagged three-pronged star, etched into the margins of several documents, a motif uncannily similar to certain scribbles in his grandfather's journal. This wasn't just a local superstition. It felt like a history deliberately obscured, a truth buried just beneath the surface. Back in the cottage, the grandfather's journal felt heavier in his hands. The pact. It was always there, wasn't it? A silent debt. They demand recompense. Another passage, previously dismissed as delirium, now echoed with a sinister clarity. The deep stirs, the barrier weakens. What was given must be given again, or the waking will begin. The three-pronged star appeared frequently, sometimes alongside crude, almost childish drawings of undulating shapes beneath waves. Dean felt a prickle of sweat on his scalp. His grandfather hadn't been unraveling. He had been documenting. That night, sleep offered no refuge. He was underwater, suffocating, yet able to breathe. The pressure was immense, crushing, as if the entire ocean rested on his chest. Shapes moved in the periphery of his vision. Immense, indistinct masses that seemed to absorb the faint phosphorescent light. But then he saw it. A soft, ethereal luminescence emanating from the floorboards near the hearth. He scrambled out of bed, heart hammering against his ribs. Closer, he saw it was a patch of algae, vibrant and otherworldly, clinging to the damp wood. It wasn't the dull green he knew from tidal pools. This was a startling, almost electric blue, pulsing with a faint internal light, like scattered starlight. Its texture was slick and gelatinous, unlike anything he had ever encountered. It seemed to have grown overnight, spreading like a slow, deliberate stain. Dean scraped at it with his fingernail, but it resisted, leaving behind a faint, sticky residue that shimmered even in the dim light. A new entry in his grandfather's journal caught his eye, one he'd previously overlooked, dated just weeks before the old man's disappearance. The signs. They bleed into the world. The bioluminescence. A beacon from the deep. It will guide them. The bunker. It is the last hope. The bunker. It was beneath a dilapidated shed behind the cottage, rarely used. His grandfather had never spoken of it. Driven by a fear that now overshadowed his exhaustion, Dean dressed quickly. The air outside was thick with fog, muffling the sound of the waves. The shed was a leaning structure of weathered planks, its door swollen and reluctant. Inside, a trapdoor, almost perfectly camouflaged, lay beneath a stack of rusted fishing gear. He retrieved a lantern from the cottage, its beam cutting a weak circle through the gloom. The air in the underground bunker was heavy, damp, and smelled of earth and something else. Something acrid and metallic, like stagnant salt water and old iron. The walls were rough-hewn stone sweating with condensation. The floor was packed earth, uneven and treacherous. The lantern light danced across shelves filled with forgotten tools, sealed jars of preserved goods, and stacks of canvas-wrapped bundles. Not just a patch, but entire sections of the bunker walls were coated in the same electric blue algae, glowing with an eerie, rhythmic pulse. It wasn't just growing. It was thriving, creeping up the stones, spreading across the ceiling like a vibrant alien moss. And in the center of the bunker, directly on the earthen floor, was a shallow, carved basin. Floating in the liquid, half submerged, was a small, ornate wooden box, intricately carved with the unmistakable pattern of the jagged, three-pronged star. This wasn't just a bunker. It was a chamber. And whatever his grandfather had been trying to contain or perhaps appease was far from dormant. It was awake, and it was here. The fear, a cold, insistent hand, guided Dean across the damp, wind-whipped yard. The dilapidated shed, a hunched silhouette against the bruised sky, seemed to sag further under the weight of forgotten time. Beneath it, he knew, lay the entrance to the underground bunker. He remembered the vague mention in the property deeds of an old root cellar, converted during the war into a small, reinforced storage space, mostly forgotten. His grandfather had never spoken of it. The padlock on the shed door was a rusted, stubborn thing, but after a few determined grunts and a spray of WD-40 he'd found in the workshop, it grudgingly yielded. A wooden trapdoor, half hidden by a stack of ancient, crumbling fishing nets, lay in the corner. The underground bunker was small, circular, and surprisingly dry. His light swept over shelves lined with empty jars, cobweb-draped tools, and then, on a small, makeshift table in the center, a disturbing collection. Dried seaweed, woven into intricate knot-like patterns, lay beside a cluster of smooth, dark river stones. Dean's stomach clenched. Nearby, a leather-bound journal lay open, its pages brittle with age. He picked it up. Scattered among mundane notes about tide charts and fishing yields were frantic, almost illegible scrawls. Words like the deep, the pull, the price, repeated over and over. There were crude drawings too, swirling patterns, a single baleful eye, and what looked like a distorted, vaguely humanoid figure with elongated limbs, rendered in shaky charcoal. One entry, dated years ago, stood out. "It demands. It always demands. The pact must be honored, or it will take more than just the island." Dean's breath hitched. A pact? Honored? What had his grandfather been involved in? These weren't just eccentricities. They were part of a desperate, perhaps even blasphemous ritual. His grandfather had been trying to ward something off, perhaps even sacrificing to it. The thought sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the bunker's cool air. Back in the cottage, the air felt different. Thicker somehow, as if the very molecules had become denser. Dean tried to shake off the lingering unease from the bunker, but it clung to him like the scent of salt and decay. He moved to the kitchen, intending to make tea, but stopped short. The small ceramic salt shaker, which he'd left precisely in the center of the table, had been nudged almost an inch to the left. His teacup sitting on the counter now faced the wrong way. He hadn't touched either since breakfast. A low, resonant hum began to permeate the cottage. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears so much as felt in his bones. A deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the island. It was hypnotic, a subtle thrumming that made the air itself feel alive, charged with an unseen energy. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to block it out, but it was inside him, resonating with something primal and terrified. He walked to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, hoping to clear his head. He looked up into the mirror, expecting to see his own weary, anxious reflection. But for a fleeting, horrifying moment, it wasn't quite right. His eyes seemed to stretch, the pupils dilating into bottomless black pools. His jawline elongated, and the skin around his mouth pulled taut, as if under immense pressure from within. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only his normal, pale face staring back. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, telling himself it was the light, the stress, his imagination playing tricks. But the image, the distortion, was burned into his mind. The hum intensified, a deep, pervasive drone that vibrated the very floorboards beneath his feet. He felt a profound sense of presence now, an undeniable weight in the air, pressing in from all sides. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, convinced he wasn't alone. Then a flicker at the edge of his vision. It wasn't fully formed, not solid, but it was there. Dean froze, every muscle screaming for him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. He sensed an ancient, profound malevolence emanating from it, a hunger that transcended anything he could comprehend. Dean stumbled backward, hitting the wall, gasping for air he hadn't realized he was holding. His skin was clammy, his hands trembling violently. He stared at the empty hallway, his mind reeling. What had he just seen? What was his grandfather trying to protect the island from? And what exactly was the price of that protection? The bunker, the journal, the moving objects, the distorted reflection, the hum, and now, that thing. It was no longer a vague threat. It was here. It was inside his home. And it was watching him. The journal lay open on the kitchen table, its brittle pages illuminated by the sputtering lantern. Dean traced the crabbed handwriting, each character a tiny barbed hook pricking at his composure. His grandfather hadn't merely observed. He had participated. The entry, dated weeks before his disappearance, detailed a lament that needed to be sung, an offering to be presented at the turning of the tide. Dean's breath hitched. A pact. Honored. He remembered the dried seaweed, the dark, viscous residue in the ritual bowl. They weren't eccentricities, not merely the strange habits of a reclusive old man. They were ingredients, components of a desperate, perhaps even blasphemous ritual designed to keep something dormant. His grandfather hadn't been a victim, not entirely. His eyes scanned further down the page. The deep song rises, one line read, and the binding weakens. He thought of the low, resonant thrum he'd heard, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. He'd dismissed it as the ocean, the wind, the old house settling. Now he wondered if it was the deep song, a siren call meant for something far older and hungrier than any human. He sniffed, trying to place it. It was almost imperceptible, yet it clung to the back of his throat. He pushed the journal away, needing to stand, needing to move. His determination, however, was unwavering. He had to understand. He paced the small cottage kitchen, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The thrumming sound, once distant, now felt closer. A low-frequency hum that resonated deep in his inner ear. A pressure behind his eyes. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was insistent, like a forgotten melody trying to claw its way back into memory. He rubbed his temples, a faint ache beginning to bloom there. Was it exhaustion? Or was the deep song truly beginning to affect him? He returned to the journal, flipping through earlier entries. There were diagrams, crude but precise, of star patterns he didn't recognize, and title charts marked with strange symbols. And then, a sketch of the lighthouse itself, with an arrow pointing to a section of the foundation, accompanied by the word access. Dean's gaze darted to the solid stone wall of the kitchen, then to the floor. The lighthouse was built on a rocky outcrop, its base merging seamlessly with the jagged stone. Access to what? If there was an access point, it would be concealed, purposeful. He spent the next hour examining every inch of the cottage, pressing against walls, tapping on floorboards. The thrumming intensified, a deep, guttural note that seemed to originate from beneath the very ground he stood on. It made his teeth ache. He found nothing. Frustration gnawed at him, but then he remembered the lighthouse tower itself. The base of the tower was thick, solid stone. He reached the bottom level of the tower, a small, circular room used for storage, cluttered with old ropes, rusty tools, and empty oil cans. The thrumming was strongest here, a resonant vibration that made the air itself feel heavy and thick. He ran his hands over the rough-hewn stone walls, following the curve of the tower. The journal sketch had pointed to a specific section of the foundation, not necessarily within the living quarters. He noticed a faint discoloration on one section of the wall, almost imperceptible against the mottled gray stone near the floor. He pressed against it, then again, harder. Nothing. He knelt, running his fingers along the mortar lines. One section felt slightly different, a subtle give, a less abrasive texture. He tried to pry at it with his fingernails. Then with a rusty chisel he found amongst the tools. The mortar flaked away, revealing a thin gap. He pushed the chisel into the gap and twisted. With a soft groan of ancient stone and grinding grit, a section of the wall, no larger than a small door, pivoted inward. It was a smell that spoke of deep earth and deeper water, of things long buried and slowly rotting. The thrumming escalated, now a palpable vibration that made his eardrums ache. Stone steps, slick with moisture, spiraled downwards, disappearing into the earth. This wasn't a crawl space or a cellar. This was a descent. This was the underground bunker his grandfather had drawn, the access point to whatever lay beneath the lighthouse. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The deep song. It was a presence. Dean's fingers, raw from endless scraping, traced the grout lines of the kitchen wall. His grandfather had been a man of meticulous order, a precision that bordered on obsession. If there was an access point, it wouldn't be obvious. The air in the cottage felt thick with unspoken secrets, each draft whispering of things best left undisturbed. It wasn't the wind, not the sea. It was something deeper, something rooted in the very bedrock of the island. He knelt, pressing his ear to the flagstones. A faint rhythmic pulse, like a slow, enormous heartbeat, resonated through the cold stone. It was there, just beneath the surface. He began his systematic search again, this time focusing on the floor. His gaze landed on a section near the old, unused hearth, where the flagstones met the rough-hewn stone of the wall. One particular slab, slightly darker than its neighbors, seemed to sit just a fraction of an inch lower. He pushed at it with the heel of his hand. Solid. He tried again, this time with a focused, almost desperate pressure, using his full weight. A faint, grinding sound, like ancient teeth, echoed in the quiet room. A thin, almost hair-like crack that wasn't grout. He found a rusted iron poker by the fireplace, its tip sharpened with age and neglect. Carefully, he inserted the poker into the seam and leveraged it. With a groan of stone and a shower of fine dust, the flagstone shifted. Not upwards, but inwards, pivoting on an unseen hinge. His breath hitched. This was it. This was the true heart of his grandfather's isolation. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders, the rough-hewn stone walls slick with condensation. The air grew heavier with each step, the metallic sweetness intensifying, now mixed with a pungent, briny odor that wasn't quite sea salt. It was the smell of something deep, something that had never seen the light. The passage sloped steeply downwards, the descent feeling endless. The rhythmic pulse from the stone grew louder, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in his teeth. The sound was not regular, but subtly shifted, like a vast, unseen engine struggling to find its rhythm. Finally, the passage opened into a wider space. It felt ancient, pre-human, and in the center of the bunker, dominating the space, was it. It was not an artifact in the conventional sense, not something crafted. A sickly, purplish light like a bruise blooming from within. It was enormous, easily filling half the bunker, its surface slick and uneven, studded with what looked like fossilized barnacles or dormant eyes. From its core, the deep thrumming emanated, a palpable wave of sound that made his stomach churn. It wasn't curiosity, but something far more primal, a desperate yearning to understand the source of the island's malevolence. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. The purple light intensified, rippling across its surface like muscle contractions. As he drew closer, the bunker seemed to warp around him. The air shimmered, and the thrumming intensified into a roaring cacophony that filled his head, drowning out all thought. The purple light flared, blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, he was no longer just looking at the mass. He was part of it. A terrifying vision slammed into his mind, not seen with his eyes, but felt, experienced. He saw the island, not as a remote sanctuary, but as a vast, living altar. He saw the island's fog, not as weather, but as its breath. A tendril reaching out, slowly dissolving the boundaries of reality. He saw the fishing boat, the distant freighter, the small planes that occasionally passed overhead, not as vessels, but as offerings, drawn inevitably into its domain. And then, the horror sharpened. He saw himself. Not Dean, the man, but Dean, the conduit, the final piece of the pact. His consciousness would become a single screaming note in its endless, silent symphony of consumption. He gasped, falling backward, scrambling away from the pulsating mass, away from the devastating revelation. The air in the bunker felt like liquid lead, pressing down on him, trying to force his back into the vision. He clawed his way back towards the narrow passage, the lantern beam wildly swinging. The entity wasn't just beneath the waves, it was here, in the very heart of the island, and it had claimed him long before he'd ever set foot on its shores. It would be concise. He ran his palm over the cold stone, feeling for the slightest anomaly. A faint chill, colder than the surrounding rock, seemed to emanate from a specific point near the hearth. He pressed harder, a dull ache throbbing in his knuckles. Nothing. He shifted his weight, his gaze sweeping the floor, the ceiling. Concise. It wasn't about brute force. It was about understanding, He knelt, running his hand along the bottom edge of the stone panel where it met the uneven flagstones of the floor. There, almost imperceptibly, a sliver of darkness, a hairline gap that widened slightly as his thumb pressed against a small, rough protrusion on the flagstone itself. Not a button, not a lever. A natural imperfection, used by design. He pushed, the stone shifting with a low, grinding sigh. Each step was slick with moisture, disappearing into the depths. This was it, the underground bunker. The sound of his own breathing echoed unnaturally loud. He reached the bottom, his boots sinking slightly into a thin layer of grit and standing water. The bunker was a single rough-hewn chamber, larger than he'd anticipated, its walls weeping moisture. As Dean stepped fully into the chamber, a low thrum vibrated through the stone floor, a resonant hum that seemed to originate from the very bedrock beneath the island. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but felt in his teeth, his bones. A wave of profound nausea washed over him, his stomach churning, his head swimming. He could see his own breath plume before him, a ghostly exhalation. The thrum intensified, becoming a slow, deliberate pulse, like a vast, unseen heart beating somewhere deep below. Not audible words, but a sensation of language, a torrent of ancient guttural sounds that seemed to unfold directly inside his skull, pressing against the fragile membranes of his mind. They spoke of depths, of forgotten names, of endless hunger. He felt it then, a presence, not just ambient malevolence, but something active, reaching. It was testing the boundaries of his mind, probing, pushing, trying to find a purchase. He saw his lost loved one, not as he remembered, but distorted, their face obscured by murky water, their eyes wide and black. He was trapped. The entrance above, though still open, felt miles away, unreachable. He fumbled for his grandfather's journal, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it into the standing water. He had to. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes darting across the cramped, frantic script. His grandfather's later entries were almost illegible, scrawled with a desperate urgency. He skipped past the early observations, the meticulous charts, the lamentations, searching for any mention of a solution, a method, a way to fight back. Then he saw it. It must be sealed, not merely contained. His gaze fell upon a paragraph circled multiple times in thick, agitated ink. The pact holds, but weakens. The breach widens. The blood of the first binds, but the final key is not forged, but given. A life offered, not in death, but in absolute tethering. A sentinel. A living anchor. It wasn't about killing the entity or even banishing it. It was about becoming the lock, giving himself over to an eternal, conscious vigil against it. He swallowed, his throat dry, his entire body trembling. The choice was stark, terrifying. The sacrifice wasn't his life, but his self, his freedom, his future, to exist forever, trapped between worlds, holding back the tide, alone. The ultimate act of reclusion. Dean reread the words, his breath catching in his throat. The implication was a gut punch, cold and sharp. It was about becoming the lock, giving himself over to an eternal, conscious sacrifice. The ink on the page seemed to writhe, the loops and slashes of his grandfather's frantic script mimicking the relentless churn of the sea outside. The past few days had been a slow, terrifying erosion of reality. The fog, once merely a feature of the island, had grown thick and unnatural, a suffocating shroud that clung to the windows, smelling of salt and something else. Something metallic and cold, like a deep-sea trench. He'd seen the gulls, usually a constant presence, vanish, leaving the air eerily silent save for the ocean's ceaseless roar. But even the roar had changed, deepening, resonating with a primeval hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. The island itself was twisting, He'd glimpsed it during brief, terrifying excursions from the cottage. The kelp beds along the shore had grown impossibly long, their fronds thick as ropes, snaking through the churning water with an unsettling, almost deliberate motion. Patches of rock, usually bare, were now encrusted with barnacles that seemed to pulse faintly, their shells slick and iridescent. Even the vegetation near the cottage, hardy and wind-battered, appeared to be succumbing. The very air tasted different, heavy and charged, like static electricity before a storm, but laced with the faint, unsettling scent of decay. Dean clutched the journal, his knuckles white. The final pages, filled with desperate scrawls and crude diagrams, laid out the counter-ritual. It wasn't a spell, not in the traditional sense, but an act of will, a binding. It required a specific place, a precise convergence of currents and tides, and an offering. The offering wasn't a life in blood, but a life in purpose. He was to become the anchor, the living conduit, the point of absolute stasis against the entity's relentless pull. He knew, with a horrifying clarity, that this meant the end of Dean, the man. He had come here to escape, to heal, to find a semblance of peace. There was no one else. The island was succumbing, the world beyond its shores blissfully unaware of the encroaching horror. He was the last line. He gathered the few items his grandfather had specified. A small, intricately carved compass, its needle now spinning wildly, no longer pointing north, but oscillating between an unknowable here and there. A heavy, tarnished brass bell, its clapper missing, and a small, smooth stone, black as obsidian, which hummed faintly against his palm. These were not tools of magic, he understood, but focal points, anchors for intent. His intent. The wind howled, rattling the cottage windows as if a monstrous hand was clawing at the glass. The hum from the depths grew louder, a low thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. It was time. The air outside would be a maelstrom. His destination was the underground bunker, an old, forgotten structure burrowed into the island's rock face, not far from the lighthouse. His grandfather's journal had marked it as the precise location, a place of ancient containment, a perfect crucible for the binding. Stepping out, the world was a visceral assault. The fog was a solid wall, thick and choking, reducing visibility to mere feet. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy in places, the earth itself seeming to weep. He stumbled through the swirling gray, guided more by instinct and the faint resonating hum than by sight. Every twisted branch, every strangely shaped rock seemed to watch him, to writhe in the periphery of his vision. The sense of being pulled was immense now, a relentless suction drawing him towards the deepest part of the island, towards the source of the hum. The heavy steel door, rusted and barnacle-encrusted, groaned open with a shriek that was swallowed by the wind. The bunker was a single cavernous chamber, roughly hewn from the rock, concrete walls sweating with moisture. In the center, a circular depression in the floor, outlined by a faint glowing phosphorescence, pulsed in time with the hum that now filled the bunker. This was it. This was the locus. Dean stepped into the circle, the obsidian stone burning in his hand, the bell heavy and silent at his side. He looked up at the low concrete ceiling, then closed his eyes, bracing himself. The immense personal cost of what he was about to do settled over him like a shroud. He was ready to become the sentinel. He understood now. The grim ledger, his grandfather's desperate scrawls, the island's suffocating secret. It all coalesced into this single, inescapable truth. It wasn't about slaying the thing that lurked in the abyssal depths, or even driving it back to its watery prison. It was about becoming the lock, the living, breathing, conscious barrier. He was to surrender himself, not to oblivion, but to an eternity of silent vigilance, a constant struggle against an encroaching alien will. He clutched the heavy, barnacle-encrusted stone, the one his grandfather had described as the keystone. Its surface slick with ocean spray and something else. Something subtly foul. The lighthouse beam swept past his window, a weak, frantic pulse against the thick, swirling fog that now pressed against the cottage, muffling all sound, swallowing the world. The air tasted of brine and decay, a metallic tang that made his teeth ache. He could hear it now, not with his ears, but deep within his skull. A low, resonant thrum, like an immense, distant heart beating beneath the island's foundations. It was calling, demanding. The path to the lighthouse, usually a familiar trek, felt alien, the cobblestones slick and treacherous underfoot. He pushed through it, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the growing pressure in the air, the sense of immense weight bearing down from above and surging up from below. It was a maw, its light a frenzied, desperate eye. The iron door groaned on its hinges, a sound swallowed by the wind. But Dean didn't descend. He knew where he needed to go. He descended, instead, to the lighthouse's base, feeling along the damp, moss-covered stone until his fingers found the faint outline of a hidden panel. It was stiff, refusing to budge, but the entity's presence was a palpable force now, a rising tide of malevolence that lent him a strength born of desperation. He shoved, and with a grinding scrape of stone on stone, a narrow passage opened. A gust of frigid, damp air rushed out, carrying with it a smell that was worse than anything outside. A cloying sweetness mingled with the stench of raw earth and something reptilian. The passage sloped downwards, roughly hewn from the island's bedrock, leading him deeper, further beneath the lighthouse. This was it, the true heart of the pact. He had found the underground bunker. The chamber he entered was vast and circular, the walls crude rock, dripping with icy water. In the center, a perfectly smooth, obsidian-like slab stood like an altar, surrounded by ancient, eroded carvings that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. Here, the entity's presence was overwhelming. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical sensation, a crushing weight on his chest, a high-pitched whine that vibrated through his teeth. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with a terrifying clarity that bypassed sight. The space above the obsidian slab shimmered, distorting the very air. Shapes writhed within that distortion, not solid, not liquid, but something in between, shifting, coalescing, then dissolving back into incomprehensible patterns. It was a glimpse into a reality not meant for human minds, a horrifying revelation of the true, unadulterated form of the ancient entity, manifested at the threshold of its domain. A silent scream tore through Dean's mind, threatening to shatter his sanity. "You are nothing. A speck." His legs trembled, but he forced himself forward, clutching the keystone. This was the ritual. This was the sacrifice. He reached the slab, his hand shaking as he placed the keystone into a shallow depression carved into its surface. It fit perfectly, clicking into place with a resonance that reverberated through the very rock of the bunker. The walls of the bunker seemed to press inward, the ceiling to lower, threatening to crush him. He had to become the sentinel. His grandfather's final notes had spoken of a chant, a binding incantation. He remembered the garbled symbols, the ancient sounds. The words were not his own. They were echoes of a forgotten tongue, resonating with a terrible power. As he chanted, a searing pain erupted behind his eyes, a sensation of his consciousness stretching, thinning, being drawn taut like a wire. He felt himself being pulled, not physically, but spiritually, drawn towards the pulsating distortion above the slab. He saw his own deepest fears, amplified, monstrous. But through it all, a sliver of resolve remained, a stubborn spark. This was his choice. This was his atonement. The keystone pulsed with a dull, internal light, and a low, grinding sound, like tectonic plates shifting, filled the bunker. Dean felt a profound wrenching in his soul, a sense of his identity being stretched, intertwined with something vast, ancient, and utterly alien. He was part of the lock. He was the sentinel. The air was still thick, heavy, but the immediate threat of being utterly consumed had passed. He opened his eyes. The entity was gone, or rather, it was contained. And he, Dean, was the container. He felt a vastness within him, a terrifying, unknowable presence that was now inextricably linked to his own being. He was tethered. Forever. The words had clawed their way into Dean's mind, not as a whisper, but as a pronouncement carved from the very rock of the island. The understanding had hit him with the force of a tidal wave, stripping away every last vestige of his hope for escape. His grandfather's frantic ledger, the island's suffocating secret, the ever-present thrum beneath the waves. It all converged into this single, inescapable truth. He was meant to be the next link in a chain forged in the deep, a living anchor against an unspeakable abyss. Water dripped rhythmically from unseen fissures in the ceiling, each drop echoing like a distant tolling bell. Rust bloomed in intricate patterns across the steel bulkheads, testament to decades of the sea's relentless breath. His gaze fell upon the central mechanism, a contraption of corroded brass and twisted wires that hummed with a low, malevolent energy. It was crude, almost primitive, yet undeniably functional. This was the heart of the pact, the thing his grandfather had tended, the thing that held the deep song at bay. Or rather, redirected it. He understood now that the tethering wasn't about silencing the entity, but about channeling its immense destructive power, feeding it just enough to keep it quiescent, like a beast pacified by a constant, meager offering. A mind to filter, to contain, to endure. The deep song had intensified as he descended into the bunker's depths. He could almost taste the brine, the metallic tang of something ancient and hungry on his tongue. His hands, trembling, traced the cold metal of the console. There was a lever, heavy and stiff, clearly designed for a single decisive action. His grandfather's final entry in the ledger had spoken of a reset, a recalibration of the anchor. He knew what that meant. It meant severing the old link and forging a new one. With him. A profound weariness settled over Dean, heavier than any physical exhaustion. The solitude he had craved now felt like a cruel joke, a precursor to this ultimate isolation. He closed his eyes, picturing the vast churning ocean, the unseen depths where the entity coiled. He felt its immense scale, its indifferent power. It wasn't evil in the human sense, but a force of nature, primal and consuming, a hunger beyond comprehension. And he, Dean, the reclusive cartographer, was to be its new gatekeeper, its living dam. He opened his eyes, a strange resolve hardening his features. There was no escape. The island had claimed him, just as it had claimed his grandfather, and likely generations before him. The alternative, he knew, was the unleashed horror of the deep song, washing over the world, pulling everything into its fathomless maw. He couldn't allow that. Not after everything he'd learned, everything he'd felt. With a deep, shuddering breath, Dean grasped the heavy lever. He could feel the residual energy of the previous sentinel's tether, a faint, lingering echo of a mind that had slowly been consumed. This was his life now, his eternity. He pulled. The lever moved with a grinding groan, resisting him for a moment before yielding with a sharp, resonant clack. A surge of energy coursed through the underground bunker. The bare bulb flickered violently, then steadied, casting a harsher, more intense light. The humming from the central mechanism escalated, becoming a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, up his legs, into his chest. And then, the deep song changed. It wasn't external anymore. It was inside him. 1,000 voices, not speaking, but being, flooded his consciousness. His mind reeled, stretching, bending, threatening to snap. Memories, his own and others, fragmented and distorted, flashed before his eyes. His grandfather's face, etched with a familiar despair. The crashing waves, the desolate shore, the fog. When the initial overwhelming surge receded, Dean was still standing, though his legs felt like lead. The deep song was no longer an assault. It was a constant low thrum beneath his thoughts, a background radiation to his existence. He could still think, still perceive, but everything was filtered through a new lens, a vast, echoing chamber of sensation. He was tethered. Absolutely. He looked around the underground bunker, seeing it with new eyes. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. He was the sentinel, the guardian, the living anchor. A faint smile, devoid of joy or humor, touched his lips. It was a terrible cost, a complete annihilation of the man he once was. His sanity wasn't shattered. It was reshaped, fused with something ancient and profound. He was whole in a way, but a whole that was alien to humanity. He knew he would remain on the island, tending the mechanism, listening to the deep song, forever holding the line. The immediate threat was neutralized. The island was safe for now. And so was the world. The future was not ambiguous. It was fixed.